So over here, inside the shelf, are the books that I've read. These are based on recommendations from famous YouTubers like Daniel Green, Murphy Napier, whoever. Basically, there are many of them that I saw tons of videos of, and I thought that as a beginner myself, I could kind of record what I've been doing. And not all the books I've read are on the shelf, these are just some of them. And I just thought, look, maybe I can just put it all together in like one video and then talk about all of them. Why not do individual videos on each of these books? Because I'm sure many YouTubers have done individual reviews. I'm lazy and I don't care. So without further ado, let's just get into the books. The first set of books that I decided to get back into were a huge name in the fantasy culture on the internet is Brandon Sanderson. I found out about him through Daniel Green, I found out about him through fucking Reddit. His name is everywhere because the dude is the opposite of George R. R. Martin. He writes faster, he puts out stuff. And the first go-to book that most people recommended to me was the Mistborn trilogy. I don't have them with me personally. I went through the graphic audiobooks for those. They were excellent. As for the Mistborn trilogy itself, let's just start by talking about them series-wise. I read The Final Empire. Now these three books I read last year. These were the first three books I'd read in quite a while. And once college got over, that's when I really seriously considered taking reading. So thanks to Brandon Sanderson for that. The Final Empire is a good book, which takes its time in order to set up the world, the politics, and everything else. I think the characters are pretty good, although they aren't explored with as much depth as I would like, which is weird for me to say because I'm just someone who just got back into reading, so I wouldn't probably know that. But I feel like, given that a book is almost like 550 plus pages long, I would expect more than what we got with certain characters. The major one being Kelsier. I think that his hype kind of led me to believe he's going to be some great character, but not really. He's pretty much like any other mentor figure, except he's hot, he's got blonde hair, so whatever. This review is really going nowhere, but Brandon Sanderson has a really good way of, setting up things that pay off later, and he does that very well. I think it's very simplistically written. If what you're looking for is something very descriptive and very poetic, these books are not that, and that kind of disappointing. The magic system, which again this was all hyped up, so when I read the magic system I was like, it's telekinesis with limitations, but I think the fun isn't really in the magic system itself, but how it's implemented in the later books, including this one, although I think it's implemented even more creatively and cleverly in the later books. I thought the dynamics between the main characters, Vin and Kelsier, was really good, and Vin was a really good character. I didn't think the romantic elements in the book really worked, and that kind of is an extension of Brandon Sanderson's other works too, which I will get into. Sorry about that, because I have The Way of Kings there and Words of Radiance. So there is something to look forward to in the later section of this video. So yeah, I read... Overall, it was a really good, fun book. That was basically kind of like an Ocean's 11, and Brandon Sanderson has said this himself, it's like Ocean's 11 meets My Fair Lady. It's pretty much what it is, it speaks for itself. Yeah, the Well of Ascension. The Well of Ascension actually is one of my favorite books ever, and I think that because people underhyped this book, they said it was kind of a disappointing sequel to The Final Empire. While I was reading it, I just kept asking people, like, what did they not like in this book? This is pretty much everything I want in a good sequel. A great one, in fact. I think the characters are much better explored. Vin being the primary focus and everything kind of revolving around her, and Ellen, who was the love interest in the first book, who I thought had absolutely no real depth as a character, finally got a lot more to work with, and I thought that just made the book a lot better because of it. I thought the romance was actually a lot more interesting to follow. I thought the villains were a lot more tangible and a lot more interesting because they were present throughout the book as opposed to the first, where the Lord Ruler is more of like a Emperor Palpatine in like the Star Wars movies, where he's not really there until the very, very end, and he's only really a plot device more than anything else. In this, I felt like the villains themselves had character, which I think lent itself to much more interesting scenarios. And the character work, particularly a new character, Oresur, I don't want to spoil certain things in the book, and I hope the whole video goes pretty much spoiler free. If I do any spoilers, I'll probably do it at the very end. And the final battle, which happens in the last 100 to 200 pages, is one of the most epic, action-packed, thrilling, heartbreaking conclusions to any book I've read. And like I had Battle of Helm's Deep vibes with this, you know, like I've seen only the Lord of the Rings movies, I haven't read the books, I'm sorry. And I don't think, even after reading the Stormlight Archive, the first two books, I don't think Brandon Sanderson has actually topped himself when it comes to battle sequences. The Well of Ascension, the only problem I really have with the Well of Ascension is that the ending is again pretty much set up for the third book. But I totally think that that's fine. But I can't deny that when I first read it, I was kind of like, why don't you just have a proper ending? I will read the third book anyway. I don't need setup for that. Through the first two books, I actually my biggest problem was Brandon Sanderson's relationship with mind control characters. The major one being Marsh, who is Kelsier's brother in the first book. And without treading too much into spoiler territory, I did not like where they took his character in the later books, especially in the third one. But overall, I think The Well of Ascension is a masterpiece. I think it's the best in the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy. And especially I have to give major props to the graphic audio. It really brought this book to life. I cannot recommend it enough. I especially think the Mistborn trilogy is a great entry point for people who want to just get into fantasy and just have something really, well, not particularly short, but it's not as long as, you know, something like Harry Potter or The Wheel of Time or, you know, those big daunting tasks. This isn't that. This is 3 books. And I thought that the second book especially really sold it, and it hit home for me. The dynamics between Vin and Orisur especially was my favorite part of the book, and I think that the way that was explored was genuinely interesting and gave me more of an insight into this world. I did not like what they did with Orisur in the third book, so let's just conclude. Well of Ascension is fantastic. I think in total, the first book, Final Empire, I gave a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. Second one I gave a full 5 out of 5. Let's get into the Hero of Ages, because this is the one that people said, oh yeah, this is the greatest ending ever, and this is the best, this is so good. And you know what, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. The third time I wasn't going to do this shit. I was not going to buy into the hype. I was going to read the book and see and judge it for what it is. And I think it's a good book. I don't think it's the masterpiece that people claim it to be. I think it's about as good as the first book in my opinion. I thought the characters were handled very well. Elend especially, he matures incredibly. It is a little bit of a jump that he begins to act a lot more realistic, like one of those kings in a George R. R. Martin novel, which I think did not really work in that, but I can understand why it was done, and I'm not going to complain about it too much. Which leaves pretty much the rest of the crew. I thought the rest of the crew, their development throughout this book was great. Spook in the third book gets a lot more to do, and I also really liked Breeze. But you know, they're the lovable side characters who get enough development for them not to be as throwaway as usual. A lot of people really have a lot to talk about the ending, and I think the ending is, for the most part, good. However, it does get bogged down by the ambitious high fantasy elements, because by the time you come to the third book, the conflict becomes so much larger, so much less tangible, because now the enemies aren't human beings, they're gods. And when you have gods as bad guys, I usually tend to back up, because I don't feel a real connection. It's almost as if the reason that they're bad people is purely because they are programmed to be that way. While they were ever present throughout the book, they were nothing more than plot devices. And I think that was where I found the third book's weakness to be most. And then also with certain characters, I wasn't a huge fan of where the characters had been taken, especially with Orisur. I know the real name of the character, but I don't want to get into spoilers. So in the third book, he has his own subplot, which essentially, to me, led kind of nowhere, and I wasn't really satisfied with it. And that was a huge chunk of the book, which also leaves me with one major character that I've kind of left out throughout this entire discussion, and that's Sazed. Sazed is by and far my favorite character in this series. And to see his arc, especially in the third book, that of dealing with his own faith, as an agnostic myself, I don't really believe in religion. So reading these books and kind of getting a different viewpoint of religion and faith was really eye-opening. And also knowing the author's background, I thought it was a great foray into understanding how people view religion. And I think that Sazed was a great character to explore that through. And I think that in the third book especially, Sanderson did a great job of portraying his inner turmoil of dealing with faith and dealing with religion. And I think that was the best part of these books. I just want to see if we're still recording. Oh, thank God. That was essentially my favorite arc in the book, and where it concludes was genuinely poignant. and very hard hitting too. Like it definitely affected me in a way that I didn't expect it to. Having said that, I do think I do still think that because you include godlike elements into the third book, it did, for me at least, it kind of just was like I had to detach myself, because by that point you're dealing with something so much larger than life. I just couldn't grasp it well enough, and for me it didn't work as well as the conflicts in the previous two books did. Having said that, I do think the book ended very well, and I do think that where they ended up, especially with Vin Elend, was, again, it was pretty sad to read, but it was very well done. It doesn't have the most happy ending. It's very bittersweet, and I really like that. And it was pretty ballsy for an author to do what he did at the end. After reading these three books, I knew that I wanted to read more fantasy. So that brings us to this long-winded discussion too over here. By the way, my Goodreads rating for the final, sorry, what was it? Oh my god. The Hero of Ages is a solid 4 out of 5. They're all pretty good books, and I think you should read them. Yeah, my favorite is the second one, followed by the first and then the third, but they're all pretty good books, and you should read them. That's that. So, once college concluded, once the year concluded, and my internship had concluded, I was kind of on my own. And I thought, okay, what are some of the things that I could do aside from certain video projects that I was working on? I was like, you know what, I want to read more, because watching films and TV shows, there's kind of a point in my life at least where I felt like I need more. I need something more intricate, more complex, something that I can invest my time into for a longer period of time. So I decided to start with Brandon Sanderson again, and that's when I ordered The Way of Kings. I really hope it's in focus, because I don't know. Anyways, when I bought this book, little did I know that this was just part one. So once I concluded the book, I realized that this was the end of part one. Brandon Sanderson has written a foreword at the back in which he claims that he had to divide the book into two, which I think actually works in favor of books that are as large as these, because these books, especially when you divide them into two parts, they become a lot more digestible. And as I was reading this book, once I finished it, and while I was waiting for part two to come, I began reading The Lives of Locke Lamora, which was another series, The Gentleman Bastards. This was what many people call kind of like the next level. You know, this is where you start delving into really high fantasy. This is exploring a completely new world. Mistborn did that too, but it was kind of relegated down to one city, which was Luthadel. In this, you have an entire new planet called Roshar. You have multiple characters stretched out across the globe. Sometimes they are major parts of the main plotline, some of them which are interspersed throughout different parts in the book, which are called interludes. They delve into the other aspects of the world, into deeper fantasy elements. Oh, can I just do this? Does the book fall off? I don't know. If this is in the background, it looks like it is, but whatever. This book is a big investment. It's about 1,000+ pages long. It follows 3 principal characters that are kind of at different locations, and they don't really their plotlines don't really intersect, especially in this book, until much later at the end. While I was reading it, one of the things I realized as I was going on was that I actually found myself willing to go through the slower parts of the book, which is what many people complained about in many of the reviews that I've watched and read, that the book kind of really takes its time. And for me, that was kind of what I liked about it. I did not want to get into the meat of the conflict right away. So the way the book begins is actually with a couple of prologues and a lot of setup, which I didn't particularly like, but by the time we got around to page 40 or 50 or so, that's when we were introduced to the real main character of this book, which is Kaladin Stormblessed. Does he have a full name? I really don't know. They just call him Kaladin Stormblessed and later on in the book. But so let me just give you my overall thoughts on the book and move on, because I do not want to waste too much time. I think this book, if you are willing to be patient and read through, I think this book is a masterpiece. I loved the exploration of the deeper world. I loved the 3 principal characters, especially Kaladin, who's the main focus of this book, and you also get to know his backstory, which I thought was very well handled and it went into really good detail. Of course, there are some aspects of the book that do not work for me. I thought the interludes they kind of broke the plot for me. They almost felt like filler episodes in an anime. There are certain subplots that don't really go anywhere, but they are few and far between. But a lot of the book feels very deliberately written, very deliberately paced, and it feels so well structured. And I especially love that this book really has that mystery element to it that even Mistborn did, but it's on such a bigger scale. You figure out the powers that the main character has slowly. You figure out how the world kind of works, the politics, the intricacies of it all. It's all given to you relatively slowly, so that by the time you reach the end, you have a pretty good idea of how everything works. I really liked how this book also kind of delves into this world's version of racism, which I thought was really good. And I thought that, particularly once you get to the end, where they take Kaladin's character, it was very poignant, and I thought his arc especially was the most effective in the book. The other two characters who do not get as much spotlight as Kaladin, but are equally as important, are Shallan and Dalinar. Shallan, I thought, was an excellent character for the first book. I have problems with her in the second book, but in the first book, I thought she was actually my favorite character to read. Not necessarily my favorite character, but whenever the book shifted to her viewpoint and I got to read more from her, she kind of basically is trying to become the ward of one of the high princesses. She goes through a lot of trials and tribulations in order to be her ward. That's a huge part of her story. And later on, as she becomes her ward and starts to study scholarship under Yasna Kholin, it's pretty interesting. And I thought that the dynamic between Shallan and Yasna was by and large the best part of the book, which is why I have problems with what they do with that dynamic in Words of Radiance, because I loved Yasna actually, because I found out that she's actually going to be a major character later on in the books. I was kind of disappointed with what they ended up choosing to do with her in the second book, but the dynamic was really what sold me, and whenever I got to read their chapters together, whenever they had their back and forth, I felt as if I was exploring a completely different side of this planet. The nature of whatever it is that they're exploring, no spoilers, but I really liked it. I thought that their story especially ended on a really good place, which kind of got fucked up in the second book. But yeah, and then Dalinar. Dalinar is basically Ned Stark, but less stupid and more reasonable. His character, I feel like I haven't really explored him entirely yet, even considering the second book, because he's not really in the second book all that much. And from what I understand, the third book explores him with far more detail, which I will get to eventually, because I have to catch up to the series, because the fourth book is coming out this year. So, with those long-winded thoughts, I think these two books are really, really good. Yeah, I think this book is excellent. I just think that if you are looking for something more, something bigger and something epic in scale and scope, I think this is a great book, because the characters are amazing, the world building is very, very good. I think the plot definitely takes its time, but if you are one of those guys who enjoys slow-paced books like I do, I think that this is the book for you. Yes, it does take its time, but I think it's worth it. And I also think that the payoff that the book has near the end, about the last 400 pages, it's pretty fucking excellent. And again, I really liked the villains in this. I really liked the main characters that we followed. The conflict that seemed to be that is being set up for the later books in the series is very interesting. The romantic element in this between Dalinar and someone didn't work for me. I thought that was very cheesy and stupid. I would actually recommend going with the audiobooks by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding for this, and not the graphic audio. I went through the graphic audio. Personally, I just didn't like the voices, especially for Dalinar in the book, in the audiobook versus the graphic audio. And also, I think that a lot of the dialogue just kind of lacked subtlety for me in the graphic audio. I wasn't a huge fan of how a lot of the voice actors seem to enunciate everything without a lot of subtlety. I prefer the Michael Kramer and Kate Redding versions for these books. They are longer, they are unabridged, they aren't as fast to get through as the graphic audio is, but I think to each their own. For me, I just preferred the audiobooks over this. After that, I jumped right in to The Gentleman Bastards. I read The Lies of Locke Lamora, and the reason I chose to read this was because I think that a huge part of why I stopped reading was because I couldn't get other series to get into. So I decided, why not kind of diversify the books that I'm reading. You know, I can probably read all of Stormlight and then just give up instantly. And I think what I needed to do was kind of make sure that I was always interested in something. And this idea I actually got from Murphy Napier, who in her book logs, video logs, whatever, she actually has like a huge haul of books, and she reads multiple at a time. And I think that's actually a really good idea if you're a beginner like me to get into reading. Keep multiple books on the side. Maybe not more than, for me, I can't keep more than two, but keeping two especially helps. Especially when I got bored with certain parts of The Way of Kings, which inevitably will happen with a book that long, I think it really worked for me in this case while I was reading The Lies of Locke Lamora, and it helped keep my interest up for the second part of The Way of Kings before I jumped into that. So, what did I think of The Lies of Locke Lamora? I think this book is the perfect antidote especially after you read something like The Way of Kings. The Way of Kings is epic in scope, the conflict is larger than life. With the books by Scott Lynch, The Gentleman Bastards, these books are definitely more small scale. And these are fantasy books. The fantastical elements aren't that big. The cities themselves are very much atmospheric, and the way Scott Lynch has written the cities. In the first book, you explore the city of Comor. I think this was an excellent entry into this world and into these characters' lives. The writing style is something that has been a point of contention for many people because the way he has structured the book is a little odd, to say the least, because it starts off with the main plot line. After each chapter, there's an interlude in which Scott Lynch explores the flashback of young Locke Lamora as an orphan, joining the Gentleman Bastards under the tutelage of Father Chains, who is the best character in the book, even though he's not present during the main plotline since he has passed away. However, I think that if you are willing to stick with the structure, which I can understand can be a point of contention, if you find yourself willing to tolerate it, which for me was pretty easy to do because I thought that the flashbacks actually really fed very well into the upcoming chapters later on, I think that this book really, it's the definition of entertaining. You cannot stop reading this. The dialogue is crisp, it's funny, it's witty, it takes swearing and makes it the best art form there is. And I think that if you are someone who's craving for something Tarantino-esque and craving for good characterization and also a nice friendship, this is a great book to start. If you do not want to follow the series, you can very much read this and then put it away because this is very much a standalone book. This does not have much setup for the later books in the series. Maybe one or two lines here or there, but there's no big world here. This is very much a plot that starts and concludes right here. And I cared a lot about the characters, I cared a lot about the conflict, and especially by the time I reached the last 100 or so pages, when the conflict really gets personal and bloody, I could not stop reading. I think that this is an excellent series to get into. I also read the second book, which I loved. I rated this a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads. The Way of Kings, I rated 4.5 out of 5, but I gave it a 5 on Goodreads because they don't have half stars. Fuck Goodreads. I hate you. I'm sorry. Vicious. So I wanted to read something standalone before I jumped into Words of Radiance. So it's something short, Vicious by V.E. Schwab, which is a superhero book. Not really superhero, they're a bunch of assholes. And these people are guys with superpowers, and it's about a personal rivalry between two people who were used to be close friends in college, but then something happened and now they're bitter rivals. And 10 years later, one of the main characters, Victor, is out to get his revenge. So we follow Victor for most of the book. I have to say, when I first started, because this is a book that many people have said, you cannot stop reading this is really interesting, very thrilling, and it is all of those things. However, it's not immediately grabbing. I think that the way the book starts is very generic, and the college setting and the friendship is very two-dimensional, and there's not really much depth given to the characters at the beginning. In fact, I actually thought of returning this book around page 100 or so because I thought that it basically felt like an edgy version of Chronicle, and I wasn't the biggest fan of Chronicle either. So by the time I got to page 100, I was actually kind of giving up on this and decided, fuck it, I'll just go back and read Words of Radiance and continue with the Stormlight Archive. But then something happened, something kind of clicked for me around page 120 or so, when the nature of the rivalry was given a little more depth. Once you found out what exactly Eli, who is the other main character of the book, has been doing. And immediately I kind of felt like the rivalry had stakes and I was a lot more interested. And then a few other supporting characters are introduced throughout the latter half of the book. And I thought that by doing so, the book became a lot more interesting, a lot more intriguing, intricate, and I definitely felt like more depth was given to the characters. What I'll also give V. Schwab some damn good credit for is that she is very committed to making our main characters assholes. These people are not good, they are not nice, they do some pretty shitty stuff throughout the book, and they are very much anti-heroes. These are not good people. In fact, one of the characters in this book says, there are no good men in this game. It actually lives up to that. When you read when you watch movies that are supposedly about anti-heroes, especially in Hollywood, they do everything they can to kind of give them a squeaky clean image. These guys, they're complete assholes. But the book does a really good job of making you as a reader empathize with what they're trying to do. And even if you need not necessarily like both of them for who they are, the book does a pretty good job of letting you as a reader be invested in the conflict itself. And there are other supporting characters who are much more sympathetic and they are nicer people and you do care about them. But overall, I thought that the book was really, really good, especially once you get past the 100 or 120 page mark. I think that the book becomes a lot more interesting. The conflict becomes interesting, and I really like the ending. There is a sequel to this. I have no intention of reading it because I've heard very mixed things about it. And I thought that this also is a pretty good standalone, and it doesn't really need further continuation, in my opinion. But if you are looking for something, a good light read, I think this is pretty good. I really enjoyed it. I'm not sure if this can be considered fantasy, but it is along those lines, sci-fi, fantasy, or whatever. Words of Radiance. I jumped back into the Stormlight Archive. And what did I think? This book, again, I feel like the hype kind of threw me off a bit because I love The Way of Kings so much that I did not love this book as much as The Way of Kings. And it's actually because I feel like these books are really meant to be read like after long periods of time. Because a lot of the information, this kind of is like repetition, especially after someone who very recently read The Way of Kings. So many things is kind of repeated, and I think that this is because people get back to these books almost 2-3 years after the publication of its predecessor. I mean, that's just one of those things, and also reading this book for some reason I kind of realized how large these books are because so much happens in Words of Radiance that it kind of like, my mind was just overloaded with so much information when I was done with it. Oh fuck, sorry about that. Someone knocked, rang the doorbell. Right. So, Words of Radiance. Really, 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 really good in some parts, but in some parts it's boring to read. It's almost as if I have to trudge through the bullshit to get to the good stuff. And I think a large part of that is because Shallan is the major viewpoint of this book. She has a huge part in this book, much longer than her part in The Way of Kings, in which she only really appeared in 3 parts. A major supporting character, but in here she's practically the lead. And I think that I was personally quite excited because I thought in the first book she was my favorite character to read, and I loved her dynamic between herself and Yasna, and I thought that we were going to see more of that in the coming books. What happened is in the first 100 pages of this book, something happens that separates the two of them. And she's practically on her own for the rest of the book. And I thought that was a big narrative choice that didn't work for me. In fact, around the 100-page point, I dropped the book, I closed it, and I just couldn't accept it. I found out later, in the end, that possibility still remains to some extent, but I think that this book made a big narrative decision that I just wasn't on board with. I know many people were, but it wasn't for me because I found Yasna to be such a compelling character, and her ideals and view of life really kind of related to mine. So I was really bummed out. But the point is, I think Shallan on her own isn't very interesting, and her journey throughout this book kind of made me feel as if it felt very different from her character in the first book. Whereas in the first book, she was someone who consistently tried to achieve what she wanted to achieve and failed multiple times until she succeeded. In this book, it almost, to me at least, it felt like she only had to do a little bit of figuring out and then she solved the problem. There are major sections of the book where it tries to describe her ability to draw maps And at this point, I was kind of like, okay, look, I get she's a good sketch artist, but then the moment she's like, oh, her calligraphy is brilliant and beyond believable. I don't know, to me, it's like, all right, this just feels like one of those things you put in there so that you can make the thing easier, like those kinds of things. Harry Potter can survive Voldemort because, love or whatever. It's one of those things, like she can draw really good, and I just don't buy it. But there are major sections of this book that deal with the scholarship aspect of her plot. And I think that those parts are really uninteresting to read because I don't think Brandon Sanderson did a very good job of conveying how she's really getting by and solving her problems. In this book, especially, she has to find the lost city of Urithiru. And there are major parts in the book where she's basically finding out more information about the city by studying maps and stuff. And there are long stretches where I just didn't understand what was going on. There are also deeper fantasy elements such as fabrials, which are explored more in this book, which I was not interested in. I thought that, especially where Shallan's story concluded, I wasn't a huge fan of, but I did like her flashback storylines, even though they weren't as detailed as Kaladin's were in the first book. I think that they were still really good, and I thought that it explored abuse in a very sensitive and subtle way, actually, and I thought that was really good. But I do not think that her main storyline was particularly engaging. And then there is a subplot that enters in the second half of this book in which she has to deal with this group called the Ghost Bloods. And for me, this is where the book really tanked in momentum. I thought that this subplot was boring as hell. Nothing of interest happened for long stretches of time, and there were parts where I almost put this book down because of it. I still gave this book a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, and the reason why is because I think this book is an A+ on every other count. I think what they did with Dalna, Kaladin, and Adolin was perfect, especially Kaladin. I think that he is the second most important character in this book, and his storyline, I thought personally, was the best part of this book. And his arc in realizing that he has to let go of his anger, let go of his need for vengeance, and understand what true honor is, I think was so well written. It could have come across cheesy in any other book, in any other movie, but reading this book and understanding it through the way Brandon Sanderson wrote his inner turmoil. The best thing about Brandon Sanderson as a writer to me is that he really challenges this character to their very core. For that, I mean, and what he does with Adolin too, I thought we got to see more of Adolin. I loved that, and I really liked where his character ended up. I'm nearly out of battery, and I'm just putting it on charge right now. I don't want to keep the previous setup, because we're finishing this bitch, and I don't want other people in the house while I record because I am shy and I do not care. Let's continue about Words of Radiance. So as I said, I think Brandon Sanderson is excellent when it comes to challenging his characters down to their very core. And with Kaladin and Adolin, he does exactly that. Dalinar is actually not a huge part of this book. He is significant, but he's pretty much relegated to a supporting character in this book. But what we do get of him, I think, is very effective. And yeah, I think that pretty much everything else in this book is excellent. I just think that Shallan's storyline in this really kind of derailed the momentum of the book in many parts, and the deeper fantasy elements for me just didn't work. I also really like that Brandon Sanderson really delved into this world's version of racism even more in this book, especially now that Kaladin is he's kind of now like a bigger name in this book. He's more well regarded, and he has this conflict within himself of how he's going to deal with that. And I think that really takes the book in very interesting directions. And like I said, Kaladin's arc in this book is fucking fantastic. So yeah, is there anything else I want to say? I have heard that Shallan gets even more annoying in Oathbringer, which is keeping me quite worried, and also one of the few reasons why I want to take some time off between this book and the next. But I do want to read Oathbringer. This has not dampened my interest in the Stormlight Archive. Another issue I had with this is I think that, especially after reading the first two books, I'm a little disappointed with the battles in this book, in both these books. I think the Way of Kings battle is far more emotional than it is strategic. So we don't really get more of strategies and maneuvering like we did in The Well of Ascension. So I think, especially in this book, there's a great build up to a battle that has very little consequence in my mind. And I wasn't very pleased with that. I think that if you're going to have a battle, especially one that is hyped up and wondering whether or not people are going to come out of it alive. I think that kind of cheapens the impact for me. I do think that the book also kind of ends on a whimper, and I think, like I said, Brandon Sanderson doesn't really know how to end his books with a finality. He always needs to add in some setup, which I get in high fantasy is to be expected, but for me, I'm not a fan of doing setup. I just like, when I'm reading a 1,000+ page book, I want to know that the time I'm investing in reading something this large is good. But I mean, overall, this is a really good book. I wouldn't read a 1,000+ page book if I didn't at the very least like what I was reading. And I really like this. Do I think it's as good as The Way of Kings? No, because I don't think it is as well implemented. I think the flashbacks don't really inform us of the present storyline. So it almost just feels like an afterthought. The Ghost Bloods subplot, to me at least, felt like a side mission on a video game, but unlike a video game where you can choose to do the side mission, in this, you're kind of forced to read through it. And also, I was hoping that storyline would get somewhere, but it doesn't. And because it's such a big part of the book, it kind of bored me to tears. Just one more thing that I forgot to add. If I ever have to read Shallan blushing, those two words, if I ever read them again, I honestly think I would self-destruct. Stop it. Just stop it. I don't care. I don't care if she blushes all the time. And I also wasn't a huge fan of Sadeas in this book, the way he was implemented. I mean, nobody's a huge fan of Sadeas, we can all agree on that. But Sadeas in this book felt kind of like a prickly thorn that's there and just annoying you, but he didn't feel like a massive threat in the book because the conflict is so much larger than him that he feels almost like an afterthought and a plot device for one of the characters' ultimate decisions in the book. But I do think that overall this book has the problem of not having like a consistent threat that again feels important. The Parshendi in this book are explored a little more than in the first book, and I wasn't really happy with that. Brandon Sanderson again loves this trope of in this, he again uses something related to mind control. And like I said with the Mistborn books, I was not a huge fan of that. I think that in this particular book, he uses it quite egregiously, and it's a very shitty way to get the reader to feel sympathy for one of the characters in this book. I wasn't a huge fan of that. I have very strongly mixed feelings on it, but overall, I do think that this is a damn good book. It's just not on the level that Goodreads rates it as. So that's that on Words of Radiance. That leaves me with 2 more books that I'd read in the last 3 months. I thought, you know what? I've read a lot of fantasy. I should really delve into something else, into sci-fi. And the thing is, there aren't that many good sci-fi recommendations which have good storytelling as well. And what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't have great characters. A lot of sci-fi works very much in the vein of exploring the concepts a whole bunch, the scientific fictional concepts, or you have the ones that just focus on the character and the sci-fi is like relegated all the way to the background. And for me, I kind of want a balance of both, and I just wasn't able to find that. So what I did was, a couple of years ago when the movie Arrival was coming to theaters, I decided, you know what, this is based on a short story. I'm a huge fan of Denis Villeneuve. I love his movies. I wanted to read what this movie was based on. I wanted to read the source material. I found it was only 45 pages. So I read through it. On one of those days in the library, I just read through a PDF copy of it. And I really, really liked it. It found that right balance of exploring scientific concepts, but also having the humanity in it. And I found out that Ted Chiang has a collection of short stories called Stories of Your Life, in which the short story which Arrival is based on is a part of. But that book was really expensive. So I found out that he has another collection of short stories which was cheaper for me to buy. Sorry about that long-winded explanation, but I felt it was necessary. Exhalation is a collection of short stories, science fiction short stories, all of them. Ted Chiang had published them through over many years, and they've all been collected together into this one book. This one came out after Stories of Your Life, and I don't think it gained as much traction as Stories of Your Life did, but I think it's better for it because I got it for a cheaper price. First of all, I think that reading short, if you're someone like me who wants to get into science fiction, this is a great place to start because these are short stories. It doesn't take too much of your time. Overall, it's only really about 350 pages, and the short stories are varying in length. Some are shorter, some are medium length, some are pretty long. One of them is about 110 pages. I think this book was fucking brilliant. I thought that the science fiction concepts and the philosophical concepts that Ted Chiang loves to explore, particularly determinism, self-acceptance, growing through acceptance, I think is such a huge part of this book. and a huge part of many of the short stories. There are about 9 short stories in this, and I think 3 of them in particular are masterpieces. Most of them are pretty good. There's only one I didn't really like, but it's so short. It's about 2 or 3 pages long. But what I did love about these collection of short stories is that these are very subtle. The way Ted Chiang writes science fiction is not beating you over the head with anything. He explores these concepts and expects the audience to understand it like mature adults. He does not spoon feed you everything. It's also amazing when he's able to write in characters that you care about. I think they're all really good, and the collective experience for me was more than the sum of its parts. I gave it on Goodreads, I gave it a 5 out of 5. But in reality, I meant a 4.5 out of 5, because fuck you, Goodreads. Put half stars. But yeah, I loved it. And if you're someone who's trying to find something to begin your science fiction journey with, I think this is an excellent place to start. And Ted Chiang is a writer you should not turn a blind eye towards. I can understand that his philosophical concepts may not necessarily be to everyone's liking, and for me especially, some of them were pretty hard to grapple with. But if you allow yourself as a reader to distance yourself from certain topics and understand that this is really a story that he's trying to tell and not necessarily a point he's trying to make, these are very interesting short stories to read, regardless of whether or not you agree with what the writer thinks or what he believes in. Red Seas Under Red Skies. This is the second book in the Gentleman Bastard series. This one I immediately started reading after the Sword of Kaigen, so Sword of Kaigen kind of ruined books for me for a while. So this one I took pretty slow. I knew that I can't compare this book to the Sword of Kaigen. Like, come on. Many people actually braced me to think that this was going to be a poor sequel to The Lies of Locke Lamora. Once I started getting into it, I was kind of questioning why people thought so. But then once I finished the book, I understand why people think that this isn't as good as The Lies of Locke Lamora. And it isn't. But I don't think this is a bad sequel. I think this is an excellent book. It's just that the plot line is not as streamlined and not as effective as The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is probably why people don't like this as much. But I do think that the character work in this book is so much better than The Lies of Locke Lamora. Locke and Jean are explored with far more depth here, and the other 2 principal characters that come in the second half of the book, Drakasha and Ezri, are also really well developed. And considering, how much there's virtue signaling and stuff like that, for a book that's trying to be progressive, I think it does a damn good job of giving these characters more humanity and not getting bogged down by, certain progressive, virtuous ideas, which is good. You should go with that, but always know that there has to be this human element to it that gives it more depth. If you just make something and try to make me care because they're women or whatever, that doesn't work for me. This book did an excellent job. I thought the female pirates were really fun to read about. The dialogue as well is very funny, witty, clever. For the first half of the book, you actually follow just Locke and Jean trying to deal with their own shit, and especially from the fallout of the first book. And I thought that was my favorite part to read. I really understood the Locke and Jean hype after reading this book, which I didn't really get in the first book, because in the first book it's really more of a group dynamic than a one-on-one dynamic, which you do get a lot of in this book. The villains in this weren't that great except for Rodionov, but Rodionov he appears in this book far too briefly to make a lasting impression. Even if the villains are pretty generic and one-dimensional, they're good, hateful bastards that you want to take down. And the ending of the book is incredibly satisfying and very emotional, and I do not want to get into it, but I didn't cry or anything like Sword of Kaigen, but the ending was good. I don't really have that many big complaints. I think the only real thing I can say is these books kind of seem to have an episodic plot with each book, but it also feels like a continuation. It's not just like, the events of the first book didn't happen, this is a completely new adventure, anybody can read the second book. No, you do have to read the first book to understand certain aspects of the second book, but by giving them a new adventure, I think that it forces the author to try something new, and I really admire that. This isn't trying to cash in on the success of the first one. And I think that works in the book's favor. I think the plot becomes a lot more intricate, a lot more complex. There's a lot more dynamics at play here. And Locke and Jean have more shit to deal with. And the more shit they're given to deal with, the more interesting it is for me as a reader to read. I loved the stuff at sea, which is pretty much the second half of the book. It takes a while to get used to the nautical terms, but you can still get by. The first half for me, though, was still more interesting than the second half. Overall, it was pretty solid. Certain plot lines, they come out of left field and they get resolved a little too quickly. But I can understand, considering how big the book is, certain things just need to be concluded. There's one element of setup in this book that kind of pissed me off. One It's an assassin character who I was not really on board with, and I did not like where the book was going with her, and it just ended kind of like on a whimper. Again, I'm not a fan of setup. Just when I read books, setup I cannot digest as well as when watching a movie. At least when it's a movie, it's like 2 hours. I can get through it, but I can't get through that with a book because I'm spending a lot of time reading one, and setups just don't work for me. But I mean, the setup isn't as egregious as something like The Well of Ascension or those kinds of things. Overall, I thought this was an excellent sequel. I had a lot of fun reading this. It definitely helped. It was a good antidote to The Sword of Kaigen, because The Sword of Kaigen is a very depressing read, but this book is a lot of fun. The dialogue is excellent. The action scenes, there's a naval battle in this. And also, I really like Scott Lynch's way of writing action. He doesn't spend far too many pages on it, but it's very tactical, the way he writes action. You get the right sense of what he's going for, and you completely understand what he wants to do, and he achieves it in less than 10 to 15 pages, and it's very, very effective. I never feel like I'm cheated out of a good action scene. I love this. It's not as good as Lies of Locke, Lamora, but I don't think it needs to be. To me, I love the first book because of the characters, and the characters are what are the major shining point of this book. I rate this a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. I loved it. 4 out of 5 is a good score in my opinion. I've always believed that you should save the best for last. And the reason I've saved the best for last is because this book is not very well known. I actually just found out about it through Daniel Green's review of it. And it's a self-published book, and I wanted to get a self-published book because I wanted to support authors who genuinely care. Supporting such authors, to me, I feel like it's nothing noble or anything, but if I can get work that can genuinely benefit an author, and I can also get to enjoy their work immensely if they're pretty good, for me that's just like a win-win scenario. And that book, The Sword of Kaigen. Now this book is available on Kindle in Indian rupees, it's available for about 200 rupees. I bought this on paperback because I can't read on Kindle at all, because I can't get into e-reading for some reason. So I am someone who has read a lot of medieval-based fantasy, and the first thing that struck me about this was its Japanese-inspired art. It's a woman with a katana facing the sea. Like, that's the most badass image there is, in my opinion. The only thing that makes this cover look a little cheap is a Theonite war story that's written right below The Sword of Kaigen. The font feels like something like Comic Sans MS, but I mean, look, we buy these things for the content inside, not for what it looks like on the outside. But regardless, it still looks fucking awesome on the outside. And it's blue. Blue is my favorite color, so you know. Okay, so The Sword of Kaigen. This book is, in my humble opinion, the best book I've read of the entire bunch. And I'm including Mistborn, I'm including the Stormlight Archive, I'm including Exhalation, Lies of Locke, Lamora, Red Seas Under Red Skies. Vicious, right? I love this book more than all of them. And that should tell you how much I love this book. Not just because I want to promote this, or in some insidious sense I want to say you should read self-published books. This is not me trying to advocate anything. This book is, in order to understand how much I love this book, I have to explain my relationship with other famous series and other famous books. Many people have cried reading scenes in Harry Potter. Many people have cried reading scenes in Mistborn. Many people have even cried reading stuff in the Stormlight Archive. I have not cried reading any Harry Potter. I have not cried reading any Percy Jackson, any book, really. The closest was Lies of Locke, Lamora. I got a bit teary-eyed, but I always thought there was something wrong with me, that I didn't cry, or at least I didn't feel that gaping emptiness in my heart. I know that's such a weird and pretentious thing to say, but like, if a piece of art can make me viscerally feel something, I always give it top-notch points, and that happens very rarely for me. Reading this book, I cried 3 times, and I choked up a couple more. The best way I can describe why this book is so good is by telling you that, at the risk of overhyping it, it has a pretty ballsy structure. The big battle in this book, which in most books really happen towards the end, happens about 35% through the book. It starts about 35% through the book. And at about 50% of the book, the battle concludes. This is no joke. The big battle concludes. And the second half of the book deals with the aftermath of this big battle. How this village is dealing with the shocking aftermath, with the devastating losses, and it's one of the most effective, and it really delves in. The second half of the book is basically an epilogue of the battle, and it's not pretty to read. This is not a grim dark book in any way, but what this book does so well and so effectively is that it makes you care about these characters within hardly 200 to 300 pages. And then when the battle hits, the death count is insurmountable. I've never seen a book kill off these many characters so early. And the fallout that you deal with in the second half of the book was what made this book stand out to me. Any book can have a good battle and have devastating consequences, but one of the things that many fantasy books don't actually deal with is the aftermath of war. What do you do after you win the big fight? How do you rebuild yourself? How do you move on after you've lost so much? And this book actually very, very boldly explores that. And to me, it was so effective. Around the halfway point, I actually, like when the battle concluded, I was shell shocked and I did not know what to do, what to say, and I was silent. And reading the second half, it definitely, pacing wise, it's a lot slower, and I can see that being a problem for many people. But once you see where the book is actually building up to, and seeing that this is the story of Misaki and it's her story, she's the main character of this book. The book actually has kind of like this Hitchcockian structure. If you've seen movies like Psycho or The Village, where they introduce a character that you think is the main character, but then around the halfway point you realize that's not really what the story is about. It's about something else and something bigger than that. That to me is what this book's strength also lies in that Misaki is the main character. You don't really see mothers being the main character of many fantasy stories, and I thought that also was what made it unique. And it also doesn't do this weird virtue signaling. This book does not have any of that, I can assure you. You really get behind Misaki. You really understand her motivations, her needs, her wants, her pains, her sacrifices, her loss, her grief. I've never felt this strong empathy for such a character. And I know that like this is not considered like, a blockbuster book or anything like that, but it's so intense at times, and it's so heartbreaking. It's so relentlessly heartbreaking at times to read. It's effective writing, and for me, of all the books I've read, this is my favorite book I've read so far. And I know that's high praise. This is not a perfect book. I can complete. The beginning is a little cliche. There are certain terminology in the book that doesn't really work, in my opinion. But I mean, you can. Like for me, I found it fascinating, but I can see that it can be annoying for some people. The world is while original and interesting, the magic system is also pretty much waterbending, but much more violent and much more gory. I do think that some developments in the plot can be better, but I'm pulling hairs here. I mean, if you were to ask me what I really thought was wrong with this book, I would tell you absolutely nothing. Because I think this book really... The only way I can actually review this book is to tell you how I felt after reading it. That's the best that I can do. The characters are excellent. The plot is very intricate, and the way it deals with propaganda, the way it deals with the nature of war, it's not pretty. And this is not a fun book to read. At times, this book literally, it took my heart out, it ripped it out, stomped on it multiple times. But I think it's all the better because it does those things to you as a reader. And I was just happy that I felt those things while reading a book. I knew that a book can do that for me. The writing style is absolutely accessible to anyone. And if you're someone who actually wants to begin in fantasy, who doesn't want to make that big an investment, this is a standalone book. The book is pretty easy to read through. It's quite well paced, and I mean, even the font isn't as big as other books. It's fairly large enough, and at 651 pages, it's not as big a commitment as something like the Stormlight Archive, which is 1,000 plus pages. I paid about 2k rupees to get this. I don't regret a single rupee. It's worth every penny, rupee, paisa, whatever. It's so good. Please read it. If you haven't read it already, I gave it a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads. I don't throw this out normally, but I mean, I can see why someone would think so, especially considering the stack of books I've read. That was my foray into reading. I may sound like one of those guys who likes to read a lot, but I really didn't. Developing a habit, I think, is always healthy in some way or another. And reading books really definitely was a fun way to spend my time, if anything else. So let me just have that book shot that everybody on YouTube loves to have. Oh, by the way, I am reading The Blade itself. I'm about halfway through it. I'm really enjoying it. Maybe 3 months later, I might review this along with a bunch of other books. These are the books I have read. I hope that the selection was interesting and you liked it. And I hope you like this video. And if you enjoy this new stuff that I'm doing, I don't really review books in any way, but if you like what I'm doing, maybe subscribe. I don't care. I don't get any money off this video anyway, so I mean, you know what? Do whatever you like. Life is in your hands. I have no idea what I'm doing, but this is so much more relaxing to do. And if you guys really enjoy reading, this is the book I would recommend if you just want something standalone. If you're looking for something else, want to get into a big series, Mistborn is a great place to start. Another great one, Vicious, is pretty short and fun to read. And I love The Gentleman Bastards, but Gentleman Bastards takes some time after you read a couple of books. The Gentleman Bastards kind of gives you a new side of fantasy that's not really explored in many other fantasy books. This is very small scale, there's no big world to save. And I like that. I think that makes it so much more interesting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, whatever this was. I don't know why I'm laughing, but I never expected myself to review books at any point. But life is full of surprises. Have fun.